Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Foley. I'm Business Development Manager for Siemens RuggedCom for our Cybersecurity division. What my job is to do is to help secure critical infrastructure. When we talk about critical infrastructure, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. These are some of the topics that I'm going to go over. They range from quite a bit, but what I'm trying to do is trying to highlight what that means and how it can relate to from a national defense standard. First, I want to go over what the landscape is from a cybersecurity standpoint. If we look at what we do from a Siemens standpoint, we normally look at cybersecurity from an OT perspective, not from an IT perspective. We partner with a company called Atos in order to help secure our IT infrastructure, but we have 177 years in the OT environment and in critical infrastructure. There was a discussion on Tuesday about cybersecurity and the definition of cybersecurity. And it's like, what is that definition of cybersecurity? And the fact that it means different things to different people. And I think this is a very good quote here, because if you look at this, when I was doing stuff, I was looking at networks and stuff. My very first network, I was taking a telephone line and connecting two computers together. I was doing IBM token ring in order for enterprise networks. And the biggest thing that was happening was denial of services to either Netscape or Alta Vista, and that made the big news. That is what is happening 30, 40 years ago. What happens today is much, much different, and it has a bigger impact to overall the economy and to our safety. Go. All right, so we know that things are changing in the landscape, right? We know that over time that it's no longer for the OT environment, it was security by obscurity. It was to put your head in the sand, you had different protocols, you had different connectivity. That is no longer the case now. It's no longer the fact of just because we were talking SCADA protocols in the OT environment, we were talking Modbus, DNP3, that is not what the internet was built off of, so people didn't know about those. That is very much aware in what's happening now and the hacking authority, and we know this. So factories, automation, food and bev, pharma, utilities, water, wastewater, transportation, all of these are using OT protocols, and they're using OT standards to do that. But there's still the connectivity of the IT environment. So we know that all of this is happening, and the fact that it does impact the organization and how we operate today from a safety standpoint. Why is this such a big deal? Well, it's the connectivity to devices, right? It's the big data. And that was a terminology that was used a long time ago. Data is king, right? I always say, why is Facebook and Google so successful? It's because they have all that information. And the more information you have, the more that you can get that information in, the more you know what to do with it, right? So the connectivity to devices is being used for one is for the automation, is to make the people's job easier, but you also get a lot more information out of it. That information you get out of it helps you simulate or to model what's happening, right? It helps you to configure your devices to make sure that stuff is going a lot smoother, right? It's not just the fact of logging in, connecting to it, but it's the resources that you do that, right? Published vulnerabilities are up. We'd like to talk about that a little bit because of the fact of what, if we looked in the past, you wouldn't see about vulnerabilities being published. It was if something happened on your network, you wanted to hide it, right? You didn't want to publish the fact of you've been hacked. Because if you've been hacked, you have a vulnerability. If you have a vulnerability, you've exposed yourself. And if you've exposed yourself, then you've opened yourself up for more hacking. But these vulnerabilities now, if you look at all the standards and all the requirements, those are really changing right now. We're knowing and we're getting the communication between organizations and departments, and we're sharing that information, getting more knowledge out there with what's going on with these vulnerabilities. We also have connected factories. So connected factories, and from a automation standpoint, the connected factories are very important. I was just talking a little bit about the semiconductor world and what's going on with that. The semiconductor world, all of that stuff was offshored a while ago because it was cheaper to do that. It was cheaper to get it offshore. But from a security standpoint, all that stuff is now being onshored. We want to make sure that we are securing these chips where they're manufactured and what's happening. The U.S. signed in a chip bill, which is taking all of the chips and everything that's happening overseas, and it's bringing those chip manufacturers into the U.S. Europe is doing the same thing. They're building chip manufacturers into the U.S. We want to make sure that all of these factories and automation is being done more regional or in-house, right? You have a little bit more control over what's going on, and you can ensure what's going on in those factories is not going to embed any ransomware or anything in there. So I was going around a while ago, and we were talking cybersecurity, and I work for Siemens. Siemens is a German company. We would have an annual sales meeting. In that annual sales meeting, one of the guys says, "Can you help me talk to one of their customers on the way home?" And I said, "Sure." I went to talk to the customer, and the guy gave me an hour of his time. 45 minutes into that conversation, he put up his hand, and he goes, "Jeff, I don't care." And this was a large utility in the European region. And I said, "What do you mean you don't care?" He goes, "Jeff, I'm not from the US. I don't need to follow your NERC-CIP regulations over there. So I'm not mandated to do that." He goes, "What concerns him is if they get hacked. If they get hacked, it makes the news. If it made the news, the board of directors found out about it. Then if the board of directors found out about it, then it came back and it impacted them." And I'm like, how do I have a conversation with this person? How do I talk cybersecurity to them? There was nothing motivating or driving him to do that. So what is going on now, and we see with the NIST II directive and the CRA, there is the mandate to do cybersecurity, right? We want to secure our critical infrastructure. Now he has motivation. By the way, it was the same month a year later, they got hacked. So while he didn't care a year ago, he did care 12 months later. So while there's these regulations that are coming out, and there are different regulations in every country, so they're starting to look at, why are you going to do this? And I always say there are two reasons why you do cybersecurity. Is either you've been hacked or you've been mandated. It's a pretty cynical view of stuff, but normally you don't have the time, the resources, the money in order to add that extra cost from an OT environment. So those are the driving factors. But once you start doing that, most people are looking at regulations as in compliance. It's a check mark in time, saying, I need to do this because I'm going to be fined or I'm going to do this. So I'm going through that check mark and saying, check, it's done. That is a check mark in time. It's what is known. So if you know about the WannaCry virus, which is a virus that was in a browser for over a decade, nobody knew about it, you could have been compliant, but you may not have been secured because you were not addressing that. So I always talk about, when you're doing cybersecurity, go for security. Go to the extreme and embrace the concept of security, not just being compliant, because the standards will change. We've already seen this from the NIST directive to the NIST II directive. In the US, there's the NERC-CIP, or North America Energy Reliability Corporation, which does the standards for bulk electric utilities in the US. They started off, by the way, NERC was around in 1968. Nobody cared about NERC at that point. They had NERC version 3, and then in 2015, President Obama signed an executive order saying that they were going to secure the critical infrastructure in the US. At that time, the critical infrastructure in the US was identified as just the bulk electric system. No other vertical, no other market was critical infrastructure. But when they did that, they said, okay, they're going to go from NERC version 3 to NERC version 5. And the change in that from 3 to 5 were two important things. One is you had to provide documentation and evidence. You had to prove, when you got audited, that you're doing what is supposed to be done. You had to provide documentation to say, I'm securing my network, I've got configuration files, here's the network diagram, here are the network configuration files. Then two, the important thing, which really changed the security in the US for the bulk electric system, was you could be fined up to $1 million a day per incident. That was the motivation. You have something similar to that with the NIST II directive, being fined up to $10 million a day, or 2% of the global income, right? So there is the motivation as to why you're doing that, right? Because you don't have the money to spend it, but you're going to do that motivation. This is a pretty busy slide. And I like this slide from the fact of it tells a lot of stuff. And actually, the original slide was not like this, but I think there's a lot of information that's important on there. If we look on the right-hand side, these are the requirements, right? These are the requirements that say, here's the things that you must do or that you have to do, right? There is the NIST II directive, there's NERC-CIP. The important thing on this, I think for the US economy especially, if you look at the top right-hand, there's the CIRCA and then there's the SEC. Those are two recent things that happened, which I think are very important, because in the bulk electric system, people had to follow NERC-CIP. But what would happen if maybe Coca-Cola got hacked? They don't have to share that information, right? But if Coca-Cola gets hacked and they steal all that information or steal all the data, that could have an impact on the stock price. And if it has an impact on the stock price, it has an impact on the investors. So now these two regulations came out that says you must notify the public within a certain amount of days to do that. And we've seen that happen, and these laws were starting to come in force late last year. This now gives visibility into the market and into the people of what's happening outside of just the bulk electric system, but what's happening in the industry. And to me, that's really important. So there's all the regulations or requirements on the right-hand side, but then there's all the standards and frameworks on the left-hand side. And what does that mean? Another good example. I was down in Colombia a couple of years ago, and they would come pick me up every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they would take me to the customer, and they would say, here's what you're going to talk about today. I remember specifically, it was a Wednesday morning. They came and picked me up, and they said, Jeff, you're going to go present cybersecurity. And I'm like, okay. And I said, what customer? Is it a lunch and learn, or what is it? And they go, no, it's an all-day session. I'm like, guys, I don't have an all-day session stuff on my laptop. And they go, no, you'll be fine. We have a translator. You'll talk in English. They'll translate in Spanish. They'll talk in Spanish, translate, and you'll be fine. I was after lunch, and we were talking, and then somebody in the back says, Jeff, we thought you were going to talk about how do we implement cybersecurity, not about cybersecurity. And it didn't dawn on me that that's what they were looking for. I'm like, well, that's a very good question. If I need to develop or follow a standard, if I need to do NIST 2, if I need to do NERC CIP, if I need to do all this stuff, how do I do that? What are the tools that are out there or stuff that helps me do that? Well, there are standards out there like IEC 62443. There's the NIST framework, and the NIST framework just came out last year with the 2.0 framework. There's a bunch of standards out there that help you do that. And these standards will sit there and say, okay, you can take this, you can apply these to your requirements in order to meet your cybersecurity goals or requirements. So these are tools that will help you out there. And then even in the NIST framework, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, they have special publications where they sit there and say, okay, if you want to secure your bulk electric system, download this special publication. It will tell you these common off-the-shelf tools from manufacturers out there today, and it will tell you the configuration on how to set it up in order to implement that and to do that. So these standard requirements really have a lot of information into it to help you implement cybersecurity in your environment. So from a Siemens perspective, what do we do and how can we help from a cybersecurity standpoint? Go. All right. So the other question I got while I was down in Colombia is they were asking me stuff about software-defined networks and digital twins and what do I think about that. And this was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I said, well, that's great, but that's really an IT thing, right? That's not an OT thing. That's not the case anymore. Digital twin is very important. And we were talking about automation. We're talking about AI the last couple of days here. And into my world, I always say when you talk about something, always ask yourself 5 questions. Why? You want to talk about AI? What does that mean? What is the use case? What are you trying to get to? How are you trying to do that? And I'm trying to come up with use cases and do all this AI, and I'm thinking, okay, so AI in the OT environment and securing that, how would I do that? And one of the things that I keep on thinking about is like patch management. And I think it was discussed. You can patch and you can automate to do that. And I'm not a big fan of that because of the fact of when we start talking about cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, we're no longer talking about boxes, right? We're talking about solutions, interconnected devices. What happens if you patch something on one device? What does that do to the entire network? And that there's I'm going to not name any names, but there's a colleague here of mine. I've got a good friend that lives in Europe here, and I'm going to go visit this weekend. He works for a large company. He's in the IT organization. They do refining and chemicals and plants and stuff like that. I was at his house a couple months ago, and it was late. I had my laptop at his table. He had his laptop open, and he took a call, and he was speaking in another language, and I'm like, okay, go and do. And afterwards, I said, what's the problem? And he goes, they had an outage. They had a maintenance window, and they did patches. And then there was an outage. There was a problem. I said, well, what do you mean you had an outage? I said, no, if you do a patch, you should understand what that patch is going to do on your network. He goes, Jeff, you don't understand. He goes, these networks in the OT environment have been around 50 to 75 years. He's only in that position for 2 years, maybe 3 years, and he's moving on. So whatever he does, the person after him may or may not know. So what is the impact of that? So he's trying to patch and upgrade systems from 50 years ago or devices. And that's what we deal with in the OT environment, is you may not always know what's on your network. and the impact of what happens on there. So if you're going to patch a system, you're going to do something like that, that's where the digital twin may come in, and that's where the AI, and doing that in the digital twin would make sense. But it's really a thing that you have to think about. Just doing AI and say, I'm going to go out to the internet, and I know that there are patches out there, and I'm going to download those patches, I'm going to do a maintenance window, and I'm going to install those patches, doesn't always make sense, and that's not always the right thing to do. There needs to be some planning that comes out of that. So, Charter Trust. Charter Trust was a organization that Siemens helped started in 2018. And in essence, there are 10 key principles of this Charter Trust. And you can go to charteroftrust.com and you can see everything we've done there. And I think there are 18 companies now that are part of Charter Trust. In essence, this is Siemens' commitment, along with all the members in the Charter of Trust, to say that we will do no harm. We're going to do things from a manufacturer standpoint, from a partner standpoint, in our industry, in our solutions, that we're going to follow processes, we're going to develop stuff, we're going to work with our customers, we're going to work with our partners to ensure that we are doing stuff in a secure manner. And this was the commitment that we made. And there are 10 key principles, and then there's the 3 key things down there is to protect the data of the individuals. That is something that is very key in the European market, not necessarily throughout the rest of the world, but it's the data individuals. And the thing about that is my mobile carrier is with AT&T in the US, and AT&T just got hacked. And I cannot tell you how many cars I have that their extended warranty has been expired because I keep on getting text messages and emails from these because they got hacked and they got my information, they got my number. So user information and securing that is very important. So, and then to prevent damage to people, businesses, and infrastructure. This is part of the security by design concept, right? We want to make sure that we do stuff as our manufacturing development, we're doing it in a secure manner as we design it and everything going forward. And then build trust in the digital world. As part of we do that is we get independently audited with 2 certification against those standards that I talked about. While we talk about implementing standards and requirements into the businesses, we embrace that in of ourselves, right? So we embrace IEC 62443 as an organization, and then we, from our factories in Germany, our factories in Concord, our factories around the world, get independently audited against that standard to ensure that we are meeting that in our processes and our development life cycle. So much to the point of, how many of you guys remember the Colonial Pipeline incident that happened, I think it was 3 years ago this month. Colonial Pipeline incident came about, and as a result of that, there was all this issues or talk about supply chain management. That was not really a big topic then, but now it is a big topic. And one of the things that came out of that was in the US, all those NERC standards, there's something called NERC 13, which is the document to supply chain management. And I was working with my colleague here, Dennis, at that time, and we were going back and forth, and the initial response I got back from that was an email with about 3 lines on it and says, yes, we are secure. And I'm like, guys, you don't understand. We need to develop a process or a document to do that. And so we came up with this document that shows you on the right-hand side of the screen there, is that we have processes, we have documentation, we have procedures in place from an organization to ensure as a manufacturer we are working in the best possible scenario in order to ensure that we are secure and the stuff that we deliver is secure. The files, the patches that get downloaded are downloaded from a secure file server, checksum verified, information like that. The process that we do following IEC 62443, everything that we do in our processes and development life cycle is something that we have developed in order to provide to our customers, so when they're putting their processes together to say we need to satisfy these supply chain management requirements, they have it documented and evidence that they can show to their auditors or to their management. Next thing is we believe in is something called defense in depth. I brought my phone up here, not because of the fact that I want to talk, but last night I was going through my mail, and defense in depth approach is a military term used back in the medieval times, right? They're going to build castles, they're going to put a moat around it, they're going to throw hot oil over the side, they're going to do bows and arrows. And I always used to have the scenario is these are the things that, do from a military standpoint to protect their territory, right? I've always likened that to the fact of, okay, how do I do it personally? How do I embrace defense in depth personally? I have a house. I have a lock on my door. I have an alarm system. The alarm system calls the police. These are all things that we do from a defense in depth standpoint. This happened earlier this week. Images show a 7-layer defense line planned for the border between NATO and Russia. So Poland put together this defense in depth plan. They're going to build a permanent fence, barbed wire, anti-tank ditch, a field of anti-tank obstacles known as hedgehogs, mines, another ditch, and a layer of vegetation. Is any one of those single things going to stop an invasion? No. Are all of those things going to stop an invasion? Probably not. But the defense in depth approach is not necessarily meant for that, right? The defense in depth approach is to give you a notification or give you some idea that something has happened. As this stuff happens, you can mitigate the impact to your organization. So if someone was breaking into my house, they break into the house, they break the lock, the alarm goes off. It's not going to stop them from breaking into the house. But with the alarm going off, the police will get notified, and then they can come and they can do whatever they have to do, right? A defense in depth approach, when we start looking at securing our critical infrastructure, says, no, and everyone I talk about cybersecurity, they say, well, I have a firewall, I'm secure. That's hogwash. There is no single box that I can put in your network, and I've been doing this for over 30 years. There's no single box I can put in your network that will make you secure. And if anybody tells you they can put a single box in your network and you're secure, you need to talk to somebody else. That's not how cybersecurity works. But if you put in a firewall, that will slow people down. If you do network segmentation, that will slow people down. If you do IDS, if you do deep packet inspection, if you do IPS, these are all things from a defense in depth approach that we use from a cybersecurity standpoint. Siemens uses a defense in depth approach also, in the point of we actually segment it, we talk about our processes, we talk about our manufacturing, and then we apply that IEC 62443 standard to our processes to do that. So we're a big believer in standards, and we're a big believer in the IEC 62443 standard. Going back to my stories about, working globally, coming over here into Europe back in 2016 and talking to customers and saying, Jeff, we don't care about NARC-CIP. I'm like, well, what do you care about? And they said, well, we care about IEC 62443. I'm like, that's great. If I go back to the US, I talk IEC 62443, they had no idea what I was talking about. It wasn't adopted globally at that point. So what I started doing is saying, okay, what is important to each organization and how do I get that to make it relevant? So I started mapping these standards together. And I'm mapping these standards together, say, from an IT perspective, we're going to see that different things are important from an IT organization than what might be important to an OT organization, right? There is the prioritization difference. In OT environments, we talk about deterministic networking. There are things that we need to have 2 to 5 milliseconds response time. In an IT network, let's Control-Alt-Delete, let's reboot, let's put a patch in. Do you have the latest version of firmware on it? Let's do it. I can't do that in an OT environment because I could cause fire, I could cause outages, I could cause damage, life, limb, property. These are all impact that will happen in an OT environment. So there is a difference in there. So once I start doing that, I need to look at what does that mean? So a lot of times when we talk about cybersecurity and implementing this, some of you may have heard about the Purdue model. Purdue model was put together from the University of Purdue in the 90s, and it says we're going to look at cybersecurity in an IT perspective, but it looks at it from a hierarchy standpoint, right? It says we're going to look at layer 0 and see what is in layer 0. We're going to look at layer 1 and see what's in layer 1. This is very much a accepted and a verified standard that can use in the IT environment. In the OT environment, we do things a little bit different. Everything in the OT environment is more around risk-based standards. And when I say risk-based standards, it's like, what is the impact if that device goes offline to the entire environment? So from a NARC-CIP perspective, they have you addressing risk to say, what is a high impact, medium impact, low impact? These are all different standards. The NIST framework has standards. They're all risk-based. So if you look at there, the IEC 62443 has risk-based. The NIST framework has risk-based. The 27001. These are all a group of standards that we look at that. And then on the right-hand side, there is a C2M2 model. And what does that mean? C2M2 model is the maturity model of where you are on the maturity curve as you go along. Have you done anything? Have you done network segmentation? Are you changing your passwords? I cannot tell you after all this time how many environments I go into that still have default passwords. And that's just the easiest thing. I did a Airbnb down in South Africa one time. I went in there, and a bunch of friends of mine were down there, and they said, no, we don't have a Wi-Fi router down here. I'm like, you have security cameras all over the place. How do you not have a Wi-Fi router? How do you not have that? I went into the garage, and I found their access point. And I had a laptop. I plugged into the laptop. I went on the internet from the manufacturer model, found the default password. I logged into it, and I found out what the Wi-Fi access password was. So changing your passwords is very important. The reason he didn't want to tell us what the password was is it was a very obscene word. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to change that on you. I don't want you to know I knew that. So if we look at these risk-based standards and we map these together and we say, okay, what does that mean and how does that look? They all very similar to the point, right? They say identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. A while ago, the important things were, I would always say, is be to identify and protect. What are the assets on the network? How do I protect them? But if you look at that defense in depth strategy and say, okay, we know you're going to get, it's not a matter of if you're hacked, it's when you're hacked, right? So if you know you're going to get hacked, you need to be able to detect it and you need to be able to respond and recover from that. Those are now the important things. And if we look at the mapping of all that stuff and to say, okay, if we're going to map it and say, okay, this is from those 5 things or from the NIST framework, but they also look into these other risk-based, I talked about those special publications. So if I want to identify it, I can look at the SP 800-18, and that will give me a process to do that. There's also tools that will help you do that too. But if I go back to the story about Europe being against one standard, the US being against a different standard, everyone embracing different standards, what does that mean, and is that really relevant? I think it kind of is, because if I look here, one of the things my free time is I sat down and said, okay, what do the NIST frameworks look like? What do the NERC-CIP standards look like? And what does the IEC look like? You're able to map that across there. You're able to say, look, NERC-CIP says, CIP2 says identify your assets. You can't protect what's on your network unless you know what's there, right? If you look at the IEC 62443, there are standards to say identify your assets. So they're very common. And this is important because the point of if you don't want to follow a specific standard, you can pick and choose what you want. You can say, I'm going to pick from this standard, I'm going to pick from that standard, I'll pick from this standard to address my cybersecurity goals. But you have to have a program to say, I'm going to adopt the program, I'm going to adopt the cybersecurity program, and I'm going to implement these standards, but these are some tools that help you get there. And then we can go into what does the NERC-CIP look against the NIST? Very similar, right? NIST says identify your standards. NERC-CIP says identify your standards. And the same thing against IEC, and I did all the type of mapping back and forth, but it's very important to do that. And the other reason I did that is we had a large customer in the US in the bulk electric field. He didn't want to adopt IEC 61850 standard as a secure substation. And he goes, I don't believe in it as a whole. I believe in parts of it. And if I implement parts of it that make sense for his organization, then he can add that layer of security in order to address his NERC-CIP requirements. And I'm like, well, that kind of makes sense. I don't have to embrace it. I don't have to do stuff that doesn't make sense for my operationalization of cybersecurity, but I can take the different standards and implement that into what makes sense for my organization. And then if I do that, how does that look on that maturity curve? How does that look on that C2M2 model? No, have I taken this? Have I identified my standards? Have I changed my passwords? Have I segmented my network? Have I added secure VPN, IPsec tunnels? Have I done encryption? Have I done two-factor authentication? These are all the different things, and the more you do, the more you add to that, the more secure you're going to be. We were talking earlier about cybersecurity. I can go into any network today, and I can add cybersecurity and doing stuff today without adding a single box. There's some basic things I can do. You're not going to be secure overnight. How do you do this? And we talk about how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Take the little bits off of that and eat it one bite at a time and have that plan or have that program to get you to that end model of what you're trying to do. Understanding the attack surface. This has changed quite a bit from what happened a long time ago to what's happening today. If we look at the attack surface, it's really, where is the vulnerabilities? And that attack surface can be both internally and externally, right? There's vulnerabilities that are on your network. If I click on emails or I do stuff like that, if I put in USB drives, that'll open up. There's vulnerabilities both internally and externally. But if I look at this from a hacker standpoint, the first thing here is what I needed to do initially was just secure the entry points into my network, right? I put the firewall there, I secure that. But what's going on in today's world, there's more connectivity, right? There is the connectivity to the cloud. And then there's connectivity to the applications in the cloud. What do I need to do? And I think the important thing when you look at this here is most people say, well, I don't want to go into the cloud because the cloud is not secure. I would argue that. I think if you look at both Microsoft and Amazon and all your cloud providers, they spend a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of effort into securing the cloud. I would say probably your most vulnerabilities when you look at the cloud and all that would be the applications that are on the cloud, and have those applications been secured on the cloud. So when you look at that vulnerabilities and the attack surfaces on there, what resources are you using on the cloud, and are those resources secure? Because if you're on the cloud and one application or one thing from one company gets hacked, and then you are vulnerable as a result of that, then maybe the cloud is not secure. But if you're using an application on the cloud to say, I'm going to do payroll on there, and then somebody else's application saying, I'm going to figure out when to do maintenance on my system, if those get cross-combined, then it would be the cloud's issue. And then how does AI have a role in all of that? I think that's important to think about from these attack surfaces and looking at this. From an AI perspective, I think it's really good to help you from information, from an analytics, from a data gathering standpoint. But I always look at networks kind of like in this view. The higher up I go into the cloud, I go into the control center or the data center, I go to the WAN, and then I go downstream to what we would call the factory floor, the different cells and all there. And from that aspect of it, I'm trying to protect each portion of that. Where would AI best be sit in there? Would AI be best down in the end where the protection stuff is? I think that's maybe a little bit farther down in the supply chain or in the food chain that I'd want to put AI. I don't know whether I'd want all that automation down there. A good example of that is one of the first things I opened up my email this morning, and ChatGPT just got hacked, and they just released it. So all of the controls that are in the AI that were there to safeguard that are now, there's a version out there that those controls have been removed. So it's from the old Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So we need to be careful about the tools we use, where we use it, and what does that impact on that from an operational standpoint, especially in the OT environment. So Siemens does embrace AI because there are certain tools or use cases where we do use AI. So there's stuff like the train controls, there's stuff like electronics, the logistics. I think if we look at it from the application standpoint and the managing of the network and managing of the data, managing of the operations at that higher level, I think there is a use case for AI. I think the further down when you start getting into protection and control or where the assets are, where the fundamentals of where the companies are doing their business or what they're doing there, I think maybe there needs to be a little bit more human intervention or a little bit more checks and balances as you look into that. Zero trust. This is another thing. Siemens has talked about zero trust for a while, and what does that mean? And if I look at zero trust to me from an IT perspective, I can see the use case for that. Now, if I take a device and I go from a plant floor from one location to another location, and I have that device, and as I go from one Wi-Fi network to another Wi-Fi network, the policies and procedures based upon my two-factor authentication follow me that says I'm allowed to have access to this or whatever, that zero trust, I can't do anything, that makes sense to me. If I do zero trust down into the OT environment, that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. I can't find the use case to justify that zero trust down there. I think there is specifically good things that we can do for zero trust, but if I look at the applications, these are more IT-focused applications, more business-focused applications than they are operational-focused applications. So I'm trying to go through these because I got like 5 minutes left. I do want to get into the defense sector, from a cybersecurity standpoint in the defense sector. If we look at this, there are things that we do from a defense in-depth approach, right? If I put together a network, and one of the newer things that are going on is, and everyone said, I'm going to put a firewall into the entry point of my network, and that firewall will prevent anything. So if I have that firewall, that cell or that location is protected, right? That's not the case. A lot of the new standards are coming out saying, I'm concerned about what they call the east-west traffic. That east-west traffic is traffic that goes across a layer 2 network that may not hit a firewall, that may not traverse to another segment of that network. But that east-west traffic, if I get onto one device on that layer 2 segment, I can corrupt the other devices, or I can corrupt everything else, right? And I can have that whole layer 2 segment corrupted before I may go to another portion of that network. So they're looking at doing that. So you would do that by using something like an IDS system, an intrusion detection system. And that intrusion detection system would give you visibility onto, one, what are the assets on the network, and then two, what are the protocols, what are the standards, or what are the processes being run across that network. And then there are things like intrusion prevention things that I can look at, do deep packet inspection. I can look at the traffic that goes across there. I can mirror it and look at it, open up the packet, see what the payload is, and then I can actually pass it through the firewall or not. If we look at this from a defense sector and doing stuff like that, and look at even from a manufacturing standpoint, no, they say, no, if I have a device out in the field and there's an event on there and I have a shiny light, and that shiny light gives me a notification that there's a problem on that device. Does anybody know about it? No, if you're not looking at that. So if I do a northbound interface to that and I go to the data center or the control center and I have an event in my network management system, and if nobody's monitoring that, does that help? No. But what Siemens has done is we've done something called a solution called CyberProtect. And this CyberProtect has taken solutions that are devices that Siemens has put together, as in there are IDS solutions with our partners, our next generation firewall solutions with our partners, our layer 2 and our layer 3 boxes, and we put all this together and says, okay, this starts in that defense in depth approach. But we've also elevated through on the SOAR process. And that SOAR process is the service orchestration, automation, and response. So this solution, or the CyberProtect solution that we're using with both manufacturers and in the Defense Department in the US, it does a little bit more than just give you that notification from an IDS perspective. It does a little bit more than create a firewall. What it does is it does an automation. We've connected a PLC to this. And that PLC gives you that analog functionality, right? So if I get an event, if I look into a syslog, or if I look into the events of what's happening there, that syslog can send something to your PLC, then that PLC can trip it and block off that entire segment of the network. Why is that important? Well, that's important if you're on a ship and something happens and if you're not paying attention, that could be catastrophic on that point. It's important if I'm in a factory and I'm doing stuff and a cell in that factory happens, there's an alarm that goes off, a light that goes off, it notifies you in that cell, in that environment, so the workers in that environment are now aware of that instead of just having some notification go off inside of the control center. So these are things that we put together as a solution, and that solution has been productized by Siemens, and I think there are 3 patents on that solution. So now that I have about a minute and a half left, that is the end of the presentations. Are there any questions? Make them quick. Yes.
Volkswagen, Allianz, and Bayer have gotten together in Germany and created the Deutsche Cybersicherheitsorganisation. Would you be open to cooperating and working with them?
I would say I am always open to cooperating that, but I'm also saying Volkswagen's a very good partner of Siemens. We have a long history together, so I would not see why we wouldn't. And if there's obviously, there's a lot of local people in the German region that I can put in contact with and see how we can do that. Any other questions?
Probably a lot.
There's going to be a test, so.
Just a quick one. For the chapter of trust, I saw among the partners that signed the agreement, there's a Microsoft and there's IBM. But the two other major cloud providers, the AWS and the Google Cloud, are missing there. Do you think they should be prioritized? Because one of the things that developed for is to protect data for the individuals and the companies. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Charter Trust was put together in 2018, and it was a select group of folks. The Charter Trust was never intended to have every manufacturer or every device out there or every company out there. But as we go forward, there is the progression of what's happening. And Microsoft, I believe, was one of the original partners of the Charter Trust because Siemens was a Microsoft partner going forward. But I do believe as we go forward, AWS and others, and I mean, Siemens is a partner of AWS also. But I believe as we go forward, there's a process in order to apply to be a member of the Charter Trust and to go through that. So I don't disagree that they probably should be. No. Anything else?
Well, that is definitely the point where we need to bring the questions to the coffee. But first, thank you very much for your opening up day 2. It was a pleasure to you.
Thank you.
And take this token of appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.